Welcome, I'm Austin Duyard with Radical Ideas, and today I'm going to walk us through a theory of revolution that comes from Shlomo Avineri's interpretation of Karl Marx. There he is on the left there. This video is a segment of a longer lecture on Avineri, which you can find for free on YouTube in the Communist Manifesto mini course. Or if you really want to deepen your understanding of Marxian theory and dialectical philosophy, you can click on the link in my profile and buy the whole self-paced online course, Introduction to Marxism. This content is from Module 1 of that course, which covers Marx's biography as well as his social and political thought. Okay, most of the content in this lesson is drawn from this book, The Social and Political Thought of Karl Marx, which serves as a great introductory book to this topic. But it's a little deceptive to describe his book that way because this book isn't just a neutral introduction, it's actually a fresh and precise interpretation of Marx that naturally goes against other precise interpretations of Marx that take stances on key issues. Well, Avineri does that too, and in so doing, he's made enemies with the Leninists, the gradualists, the accelerationists, the utopian socialists, and more. But I think his theory is worth understanding because it's non-deterministic and opens a plurality of paths to a worker state that many other branches of Marxism foreclose on. Okay, let's jump in. So this is Shlomo Avineri's theory of revolution. The top half of this chart is about the path to a worker state, and this is kind of the whole ballgame for us because this is where we're at right now in the present. The bottom half of this graph will be explained in the next video, and it focuses on the goals of a worker state once the workers actually take power. You can see how the top half of this graph kind of logically flows into this bottom half. One thing I'll say about both parts of this chart is that it's all about a dialectical concept called Aufhebung, which is about both preserving the best parts of the past and transcending the rest to move to a higher stage. The first half of this chart is really about preparing the ground for Aufhebung, or abolition, of both capitalism and the state, which will be completed as part of the goals of a worker state. So Aufhebung is part of both of these charts, but its culmination is in the second. Let's go back to the paths to a worker state, which is the focus of this video. Like a good materialist, he begins with capital's already existing material reality, or what's called capital's objective tendencies. This gives rise to a subjective socialist consciousness, or class consciousness. That turns back and mediates capital, and this dialectic between objective and subjective conditions opens up a pathway to state and deep socialist power, which for Avineri is a prerequisite for a worker state. Okay, let's explain this in detail. Now that we've seen the overall layout of the argument, let's get a little more precise. The manifesto reads, "The first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy." Like I said, this is like the whole enchilada. This is the task before socialism today. Let's see how Avineri structures it. First, the claim is that there are structural tendencies already growing within capitalism that set the stage for further developments, but they're not always pleasant or positive in themselves, as we'll see. The first is the universalization of social relations. People increasingly relate to one another not as members of a feudal state, caste, or religion, but as participants in the same socioeconomic system. Globalization means capitalism spreads to distant lands and climes, as the manifesto says. Proletarianization is about the workforce growing in strength and number, and the socialization of capital is about the transition from single proprietor small companies to large enterprises owned publicly through the stock market, owned by society, right? Socialization. More on all this in a moment. The second step implies that these objective material tendencies immanent to capital have subjective consequences. We can't just rely on the cold logic of capital to lead us to the promised land. No. Our political agency is crucial to mediate this historical process. So, the emergence of class consciousness isn't done just by having the right conversations or the right ideas. This is done through real material organizations. We need to build class consciousness through organizations and institutions like unions, political parties, and cooperatives, and much more we'll talk about. Now that we have some institutional power, we can build on that to effect change. Parliamentary and legal reforms build a strong welfare state and subject finance to public control. Now we can expand institutions. Cooperatives can syndicate, trade unions can expand into municipal governance, and much more. The belief here is that law is a terrain of struggle, not a bourgeois illusion as the Leninists would have it. That said, Avineri does not dismiss strategic revolutionary ruptures where possible, or rather where feasible, where they could be successful. Now let's go into detail and see how the path to a worker state is contingent and therefore plural and always mediated by class consciousness. Now let's move on to understand Shlomo Avineri's theory of revolutionary strategy, which I've formalized into this chart to make things as clear as possible. There's really two moments here. The first is about the path to a worker state, and the second is about the goals of the worker state culminating in its own Aufhebung, or abolition. Like a good materialist, Avineri begins with capital's already existing material reality, or what's called capital's objective tendencies. This gives rise to a subjective socialist consciousness that turns back and mediates capital, and this dialectic opens up pathways to state power and deep socialist institutional power. Once the workers have achieved this, once we control the state, there are three moments or goals to overcome both capital and the centralized state as something that stands over and above civil society. All of these relate to achieving full, deep, and real universal suffrage, or a politics that represents the people. The first step is dismantling bourgeois class power in government, the second is the socialization of the economy, and the third is about creating such a society that the coercive state is no longer necessary and can finally wither away. Okay, let's get into it. Now that we've laid out Avineri's critique of utopian socialism and accelerationism, let's shift gears and see what his reading of Marx can tell us about the arduous path towards a worker state. The manifesto reads, "The first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy." This is kind of the whole ball game in that this is where we're at right now. Okay. First, the claim is that there are structural tendencies already growing within capitalism that set the stage for further developments, but they are not always pleasant or positive in themselves. The first is universalization of social relations. People increasingly relate to one another not as members of a feudal state, caste, or religion, but as participants in the same socioeconomic system. Globalization means capitalism spreads to distant lands and climes, as the manifesto puts it. Proletarianization is about the workforce growing in strength and in number, and the socialization of capital is about the transition from single proprietor companies to large enterprises owned publicly through the stock market. More on all this in a moment. Okay, the second step here is that these objective material tendencies immanent to capital, within capital, have subjective consequences that can mediate them. We can't rely on the cold logic of capital to lead us to the promised land. No, our political agency is crucial to mediate this historical process. The emergence of class consciousness isn't just done by having the right conversations or ideas. This is done through real material organizations. We need to build class consciousness through organizations and institutions like unions, political parties, and cooperatives, and a lot more. We'll get into this in a moment. Step 3, now that we have some institutional power, we can build on that to effect change. Parliamentary and legal reforms could build a strong welfare state and subject finance to public control. Now we can expand institutions. Cooperatives can syndicate, they can come together. Trade unions can expand into municipal governance, and much more. The belief here is that law is a terrain of struggle, not a bourgeois illusion as the Leninists would have it. That said, Avineri does not dismiss strategic revolutionary ruptures where possible and feasible. Okay, now let's go into detail and see how the path to a worker state is contingent and therefore plural and always mediated by class consciousness. The first tendency immanent to capitalism that becomes a precondition for its eventual Aufhebung or abolition is the universalization of social relations, the spread of abstract, impersonal forms of social mediation across society. Okay, what does that mean? Well, at its core, it's about abstract interdependence. Under capitalism, individuals no longer relate primarily through feudal ties, caste, or personal obligation. Money, markets, and law become king. They become the dominant mediators of social life. Where pre-capitalist societies bound people through kinship, guilds, or locality, capitalism integrates everyone into a system that extends far beyond the village or family. A farmer in Iowa is structurally linked to a factory in China, consumers in Europe, and investors in New York. These connections are invisible, systemic, and unavoidable. Capitalism does not merely facilitate exchange, it organizes society into a single interconnected network of production, trade, and governance. This is why crises propagate globally rather than remaining local, as the 2008 financial crash made unmistakably clear. Economic and social actions in one part of the system reverberate through the whole. Crucially, this universalization is a precondition for collective action. By drawing everyone into the same social structure, capitalism makes possible class consciousness and coordinated struggle. Workers cease to be isolated peasants or artisans and instead come to realize themselves as part of a shared social position within a total system. The capacity for collective organization and democratic social control emerges from the very networks capitalism creates. In this sense, universalization is both capitalism's greatest strength and its latent vulnerability. It binds society together through abstract domination, but those same connections make collective emancipatory action conceivable. Capitalism constructs the stage on which it can ultimately be challenged and potentially overcome, right? If the whole system is connected, then a strike in one part of the system can affect the whole system. So this interconnection opens up revolutionary potential. Obviously related to the universalization of social relations is the second structural tendency, globalization. Under capitalism, production, trade, and exchange are not confined to local or national boundaries. They spread across regions and nations, tying distant peoples, resources, and markets into a single interdependent system. Globalization is capitalism expanding geographically. It creates a world in which economic and social life is increasingly interconnected. As Avineri explains, Marx saw this expansion as structurally necessary. Capitalism cannot reach its full development while large regions of the world remain outside its reach. So Avineri writes, citing Marx, so long as this universality of the market has not reached its ultimate geographical limit, capitalism has not yet reached its apex. Only when this process reached its culmination with the opening of Japan and China to Western trade and the discovery of gold in Australia and California, only then could the internal process of decomposition and change be expected to start. Globalization is not just the spread of goods and capital. It's the social and structural integration of a world under capitalist rules. It creates conditions for universal interdependence as local economic shocks, innovations, or conflicts reverberate globally. It also lays the groundwork for class consciousness on a larger scale. Workers, consumers, and communities are linked in a single social system, making collective awareness and coordinated struggle conceivable beyond local or national limits. A major issue here is that globalization is materialized in the real world through coercion, uneven development, genocide, and destruction of indigeneity and tradition. So my question for Avineri would be, if globalization is a prerequisite for a worker state, how can we integrate the world economy democratically without gentrification, genocide, or the destruction of indigenous traditions? Either way, capitalism builds the stage on which it can be challenged. Its global reach is both the source of oppression and the potential for collective revolutionary transformation. That's the claim, anyway. Okay, time for some extra credit. If you want more textual evidence to explore globalization, I invite you to have a look at these quotations from Avineri and the manifesto, but for the sake of reducing video length, I won't read them to you, so go ahead and pause here and read if you like. The third structural tendency immanent to capitalism within capitalism that points beyond capitalism is proletarianization. As we discussed in Lesson 2, proletarianization refers to the process by which people who once had some control over their livelihoods, small farmers, artisans, shopkeepers, are displaced by large-scale capital and compelled to sell their labor power for a wage to those big companies. So what matters here is not simply poverty, but the loss of independent access to the means of life. The proletarianization of women is a special case. Women historically did not own the means of production in the same way men did, but they exercised control over what Marxist feminists call the reproduction of labor power, feeding workers, maintaining households, and raising the next generation of laborers. But during World War II, American capitalism faced a severe labor shortage, and capital responded by drawing women directly into wage labor. This was not emancipation driven by equality, but a labor-driven strategic inclusion captured by iconic wartime imagery like Rosie the Riveter here. Capital expands by pulling ever more people into wage labor. All right. What Avineri emphasizes most in proletarianization is universal alienation. He writes, Only alienation universalizes the worker. Only a universal mode of production can give rise to a class of universal significance. Alienation does not morally elevate workers, nor does suffering automatically generate revolutionary consciousness. Instead, alienation strips workers of particularistic identities at the level of production. Workers become interchangeable bearers of labor power, and exploitation becomes structurally common. This is what gives the proletariat its universal significance. Unlike peasants, small proprietors, or artisans, the proletariat has no partial interests to defend. No land, no shops, no inherited privileges binding it to the existing order. If your farm, store, or livelihood has already been destroyed by large capital, why defend private property at all? Stripped of independent holdings, the proletariat comes to recognize that it cannot emancipate itself without abolishing capitalism itself. Small-scale enterprises may persist, but they cannot secure emancipation. For Avineri's Marx, proletarian struggle is universal, not because workers are morally superior, but because their liberation requires transforming the entire system. Its ethical significance lies not in virtue, but in its potential to abolish domination as such. The fourth structural tendency imminent to capitalism that points beyond capitalism is the socialization of capital. Here, production becomes a collective, cooperative, and interdependent process, while ownership and control of the results of that labor remain privately concentrated. Okay, what does that mean in practice? There are two moments at work here, and the first concerns the forces of production, especially labor itself. In feudalism and early capitalism, production could still appear individual. A craftsman in a workshop or a farmer working their own land. As capitalism develops, however, production is reorganized on a vast social scale. Factories, assembly lines, global supply chains, and digital platforms coordinate the labor of hundreds, thousands, and even millions of workers. So no individual worker produces a commodity alone now. Every product is the outcome of collective labor, coordinated through complex systems of planning, technology, and management. In this sense, the socialization of capital overlaps directly with globalization. The second moment concerns the relations of production, especially ownership. In feudalism and early capitalism, productive enterprises were typically owned by single individuals or families. As capitalism develops, ownership tends to become formally collective through joint stock companies, pension funds, and public markets. Capital is increasingly pooled and socially distributed in form, even as effective control remains concentrated in the hands of a relatively small capitalist class. A vast network of workers cooperate to produce social wealth, yet decisions about investment, production, and distribution are still privately made. This contradiction between forces and relations is decisive for Marx and central to Avineri's reading. One major effect of this socialization is the deepening of interdependence among workers themselves. Workers are linked not only to capital, but to one another across firms, sectors, and even countries, as we've been talking about. A breakdown or an organized strike in one part of the production process can disrupt the entire system. This shared dependence creates the material basis for solidarity, organization, and collective action. Though, as Avineri insists, these outcomes are never automatic. Here's the key point. The transition from isolated, single proprietor enterprises to a vast network of socially owned but privately controlled capital demonstrates that capitalism already relies on collective labor and collective coordination. Planning, cooperation, and large scale organization are not foreign to capitalism, they're its everyday operating principles. What remains irrational is not socialized production, but private control over it. So we now have a grasp of the four real material structural tendencies already at work within capitalism or imminent to capitalism. If these are the objective tendencies, let's move on to analyze the second moment of Avineri's path to a worker state, the subjective tendencies. This is the impact that these material dynamics have on consciousness, or rather, if the objective tendencies create the opportunities for socialism, it's up to our human agency to seize them and make the most of them. Avineri's point is that something is lost in this transition from objective to subjective, and that is any trace of determinism. Nothing about class consciousness itself is predetermined or guaranteed. It's up to us to mobilize and create institutions that can challenge the hegemony of capital. We call this subjective mediation to highlight that we need to do something to achieve socialism. We can't just sit back, kick our feet up, and let the cold march of capital lead us to full communism. That's not what Aufhebung is about. All right, so let's go into subjective mediation now. The second moment in Avineri's path to a worker state is subjective mediation, the idea that capitalism's structural tendencies do not automatically lead beyond capitalism. They must be mediated through conscious political activity. The first moment of this mediation is class consciousness. For Avineri's Marx, class consciousness is not simply a matter of awareness, education, or adopting the correct ideas. It's not produced by moral outrage alone, nor by intellectual persuasion in the abstract. Rather, class consciousness emerges through material experience and collective practice. As global capitalism universalizes social relations, proletarianizes the population, and socializes labor, workers increasingly share a common structural position. They confront similar conditions of exploitation, alienation, and insecurity. But this shared position does not automatically generate consciousness. What transforms a class in itself into a class for itself is organization and struggle. This is why Avineri insists on the importance of our agency and practice, which begins with class consciousness. He writes, if a revolutionary consciousness exists, then the revolution is bound to happen. In other words, under these conditions, the revolution is already taking place. If, on the other hand, such a consciousness is lacking, then the revolution lacks its main impulse and is stillborn. This is not voluntarism. Avineri is not claiming that ideas alone make revolutions. Rather, he's arguing that without consciousness, even the most advanced material conditions remain politically inert. Capitalism can generate crisis after crisis, but crisis alone does not act. Class consciousness is produced through organization, unions, political parties, cooperatives, and collective struggles over wages, rights, and social power. Through these practices, workers learn that their problems are not individual failures, but systemic features of capitalism. Consciousness is forged in action, not merely in theory. Avineri emphasizes that class consciousness is historical, uneven, and fragile. It develops through defeats as well as victories, and it can just as easily fragment under nationalism, racism, or competition if it's not actively sustained. In this sense, Class consciousness is the subjective counterpart to capitalism's objective tendencies. Capitalism creates the conditions for collective awareness, but only conscious organization can turn those conditions into political agency. Without this mediation, no worker state is possible. Class consciousness takes us to the second moment of subjective mediation in Avineri's path to a worker state, building organizational power. If class consciousness is the recognition of a shared structural position formed through material experience, organizational power is how that consciousness is made durable, effective, and politically consequential. Without organization, consciousness remains episodic and fragile. Gains are lost as easily as they are won. With organization, political victories can be maintained and built upon. A persistent theme I'm trying to hammer home here is that in dialectical materialism, consciousness is not treated as an autonomous realm that floats above social life. Instead, consciousness becomes historically real only through material social activity. For Avineri, consciousness does not float above society. It must be embedded in institutions, trade unions, political parties, cooperatives, workers' councils, and social movements. They're all the means through which class consciousness is stabilized over time, transmitted across generations, and translated into collective action. Organization is not simply an instrument of class struggle, it's the form through which class consciousness is reproduced and strengthened. This is where Avineri distinguishes himself from both Bernstein, the gradualist, and Lenin, the ruptural advocate. Edward Bernstein argues that institutions and reforms are sufficient in themselves by expanding democracy, welfare, and legal protections. Capitalism can gradually evolve into socialism without a fundamental rupture. For Bernstein, reform becomes not a means, but an endpoint. Lenin rejects this completely. His strategy centers on building one primary institution, the Communist Party, and using it to seize state power through a decisive rupture. Existing institutions such as parliaments, trade unions, and legal systems are treated largely as bourgeois structures that limit revolutionary potential rather than develop it. Avineri charts a different course. He insists that institutions are neither inherently bourgeois nor inherently revolutionary. They are terrains of struggle. Law, parliaments, welfare systems, and public administration are not illusions to be discarded, but arenas in which power can be accumulated, defended, and expanded. Institutional engagement does not negate revolutionary possibility, it can prepare the ground for it. At the same time, Avineri rejects reformist complacency. Ruptures may be appropriate in certain historical contexts, and reforms are valuable only insofar as they mediate capital toward worker control of the state. Organization does not guarantee success. Institutions can ossify, bureaucratize, or be captured by capital if they lose contact with active struggle. What matters then is not any single organization, but an ecology of institutions mediating between workers and the state, between economic struggle and political power, and organizational power is the material bridge between consciousness and state power. It's how a class learns to govern before it governs. For Avineri, a worker state is rarely seized first and built later. It must be prepared through institutions that already embody collective power in practice. Now that we have a grasp of the first two moments in Avineri's path to a worker state, The objective tendencies of capitalism, which create the opportunity for the rise of our ability to subjectively mediate capital through class consciousness and organizational power, we can see how this dialectic opens up a plurality of routes to state power. What I like is how the objective and subjective tendencies come together and unite to open routes to state power. These roots are the unity of the two previous different moments. Avineri's point is not to foreclose on any of these possibilities. Rather, he critiques both Leninists who insist on a single violent rupture and gradualists who assume reforms alone are sufficient. With this context in mind, let's explore what these multiple paths actually look like. One of the routes to state power that Avineri emphasizes is parliamentary and legal reforms. This path does not bypass the working class or the need for class consciousness and organizational power. Rather, it builds on these foundations to gradually extend workers' influence within state structures. So reforms are not the end goal, as the gradualists suggest, and they're not distractions, as Leninist rupturalism claims. They're means of mediating capitalism towards social control by the working class. Through parliaments, legal systems, and constitutional processes, the working class can achieve practical gains that prepare the way for a workers' state. Regulating finance through public banking, capital controls, limits on speculative activity, or monopoly regulation disciplines capital and redirects investment towards social needs. Public banking belongs to Route 1 when it is created through legislation, operates as a state institution, and is accountable to public authorities. Examples include national development banks, postal banking systems, and public infrastructure banks. Capital controls regulate money flows across borders, such as taxes on short-term flows, restrictions on capital flight, or approval requirements for large foreign investments. Limits on speculative activity include financial transaction taxes, restrictions on derivative trading, leveraging caps, and separation of commercial and investment banking. Monopoly regulation, like antitrust laws or limits on mergers, reduces the ability of a few corporations to dominate markets, ensuring collective planning and democratic oversight. Legal reforms can also expand social welfare through universal health care, pensions, UBI or some kind of guaranteed income, public housing or unemployment insurance, and a whole lot more. Protecting and expanding labor rights through collective bargaining, workplace safety laws, and anti-dismissal protections strengthens workers' capacity to organize. Developing infrastructure, transport, energy, communication, and housing lays the material foundation for collective provision and democratic planning. These measures stabilize and strengthen collective organization while showing that state institutions are not monolithic. Law and parliamentary procedures are terrains of struggle, providing openings for negotiation, intervention, and the accumulation of governing experience by the workers. Each reform both protects workers and prepares them for deeper transformations, prefiguring a workers' state without relying exclusively on rupture. At the same time, Avineri cautions against reformist complacency. Reforms can be reversed or hollowed out if disconnected from unions, cooperatives, and mass movements. In short, parliamentary and legal reforms are a strategic lever in Avineri's pluralist approach, allowing workers to exercise power, accumulate governing capacity, and mediate capital, including finance and monopoly, toward collective control without abandoning revolutionary aims. The second route to state power in Avineri's framework is pre-worker state institution building. It builds directly on level 2, subjective mediation, where class consciousness is formed and basic organizational capacity is developed. But in level 3, that mediation becomes deeper, more durable, and materially effective, whereas subjective mediation focuses on the emergence of class consciousness and early organizational forms. Level 3 institutional power embeds that consciousness in institutions capable of sustained governance, coordination, and collective control. The crucial shift is not the appearance of new institutions necessarily, but a change in what existing institutions are able to do. This explains why many of the same institutions appear in both stages. In level 2, which is about subjective mediation, unions, councils, cooperatives, and municipal bodies primarily focus on forming consciousness, coordinating struggle, and defending gains. In level 3, these institutions deepen in function and capacity. Unions begin to administer pensions, training systems, or workplace standards. Workers' councils move from voicing demands to participating directly in workplace and social governance. Municipal councils shift from lobbying higher authorities to exercising democratic control over things like housing, transportation, energy, and public services. Cooperatives evolve from isolated enterprises into federated networks or syndicates, coordinating production, credit even, and distribution beyond the firm level. Additional institutions further extend this transformation. Credit unions and public-oriented financial institutions redirect savings towards social needs rather than private accumulation. Mutual aid networks organize care and survival outside the market, reducing dependence on commodified services. Social movements and political parties translate local struggles into society-wide priorities. Housing cooperatives and public service collectives bring democratic control into everyday life and social reproduction. Avineri's institution building is decentralized in its development, emerging bottom-up through a network of institutions. This decentralization allows workers to build real governing capacity through participation rather than top-down command. However, Avineri does not envision permanent decentralization like the anarchists. This is because we need to challenge modern production and capital, which are highly centralized and interdependent. Instead, for Avineri, local institutions are meant to federate, coordinate, and scale, creating democratic forms of centralization. But who knows, if we overcome capitalism, maybe we can gradually decentralize while remaining federated through mutual consent rather than any top-down coercion inherent to any centralized body. But we'll get there in a little bit later when we talk about the Aufhebung of the state as a goal of the worker state. To sum up here, Level 3 institutions are central for Avineri because it allows workers to govern before they govern. Through institutional practice, they gain real experience managing resources, coordinating collective labor, and exercising democratic oversight. This practical capacity strengthens Root 1, enhancing the ability to leverage parliamentary representatives, legal reforms, and public policy. At the same time, it prepares the ground for rupture where necessary, ensuring that organized, experienced structures already exist. The third route to state power in Avineri's framework is rupture, strategic, discontinuous action that challenges the existing order. Unlike routes 1 and 2, which work through gradual institutional embedding, rupture focuses on moments of crisis or opportunity where the working class can assert power in ways that normal channels of politics and organization cannot. At first glance, this may sound Leninist. Lenin emphasized the necessity of a decisive break. The Communist Party must seize the state through revolution, bypassing or even smashing existing institutions, which he often saw as inherently bourgeois and constraining. Lenin's approach relied on democratic centralization. Power and decision-making were concentrated in the party, which acted as a disciplined vanguard to direct the revolution. Legal and institutional engagement was largely secondary or instrumental. Avineri shares with Lenin the recognition that rupture may sometimes be necessary, especially in contexts where capitalism's contradictions erupt violently or where reformist paths are blocked. He also agrees that transformative change occasionally requires confrontation and rapid seizure of power. However, Aveniri's approach is fundamentally different. Rupture is contingent, tactical, and deeply integrated with institutional power. Unlike Lenin, Aveniri does not centralize authority in a vanguard. His institutions are decentralized in development, emerging bottom up through unions, cooperatives, workers' councils, and municipal bodies. Successful rupture depends on a broad, organized, conscious working class already exercising power through these institutions. Existing structures are not obstacles to be smashed, they are resources and terrains of struggle. So, in Aveniri's vision, rupture is a lever within a pluralist strategy, accelerating or consolidating gains when conditions demand it. Legal reforms, cooperative networks, and municipal councils are not abandoned, they strengthen the capacity for rupture. The takeaway is that rupture is both similar and radically different from Lenin's model. Similar in recognizing that discontinuities may be necessary, different in grounding those continuities in a prepared, organized, institutionally supported working class with decentralized development rather than a centralized vanguard party. Revolution for Avineri is always connected to everyday material power, especially institutional power, and existing democratic practices. Let's go back to our Leninist critic of Avineri, Alan Gilbert, who writes about Aveneri's reading of Marx. He says Gilbert's Leninist approach might enable us to escape from attributing to Marx the curious view that no revolutionary or political action can make a contribution to socialism until economic circumstances have ripened. Gilbert's basically saying that if you follow Avineri, it looks like Marx is being overly passive, just waiting for capitalism to develop enough before the working class can act. But Avineri would respond that this is a misreading of Marx. For him, the point isn't that revolutionary or political action is irrelevant until conditions ripen. Rather, Marx emphasizes that action must be grounded in the objective conditions of society, the level of productive forces, socialized labor, and economic networks. Political and revolutionary efforts are meaningful, but they are effective only when they engage with these real material conditions combined with organized class consciousness and institutions. In other words, Aveniri's Marx is neither fatalistic nor gradualist, and also not purely opportunist or voluntarist. He doesn't suggest passively waiting for history to unfold. Instead, the working class must act strategically, using political power to shape and accelerate capitalism in ways that make socialism possible. Economic conditions set the stage, but consciousness, human intervention, and organization are what transform potential into real social change. So the takeaway is that Marx isn't saying wait for ripeness. He's saying that capitalism has already created the material conditions, and now it's time to act in a way that makes that potential real. It's time to act in a way that makes ripeness matter. Revolution is always both materially conditioned and politically mediated, and Aveniri's reading highlights that balance. I made this diagram so we can visualize Aveniri's path to a worker state that we just explained in detail, but let's summarize before moving on. Like a good materialist, Aveniri begins with material reality in the present, capital's objective tendencies, the universalization of social relations, globalization, proletarianization, and the socialization of capital. These tendencies give rise to, or at least makes possible, class consciousness embedded in material institutions, which can then dialectically turn back on and subjectively mediate our material reality, particularly capital. When a class becomes conscious and organizes itself with institutions, institutional power capable of mediating capital, roots to state and further institutional power become walkable. As we pursue roots to deeper power, this process again dialectically turns back on and deepens class consciousness. So that's Avineri's theory, and that's the reason for these blue arrows facing in the opposite direction on the chart there. What's important to notice from a dialectical standpoint is that Avineri's path to a worker state follows the classic triad of unity, difference, and then unity in difference together. If the first two categories are opposites, objectivity and subjectivity, his third category is the union of opposites. Avineri offers paths, legal reforms, institutional power and governance, and revolutionary ruptures where they are feasible. When we say Avineri is not a determinist, he's a pluralist, it's these last three categories or options or paths that we mean. But we've yet to talk about one essential aspect of Avineri's theory that spans across all three levels, and that is universal suffrage. Universal suffrage for Avineri is more than just voting rights in a bourgeois state. It's the material condition that allows the working class to enter the state as an active force, turning political equality into a terrain for mediating class power and preparing the dialectical overcoming of both the capitalism and the bourgeois state itself. So let's take this step by step. Regarding the objective conditions, universal suffrage does not directly arise here, but these tendencies make a mass polity capable of participating in elections and institutional life. So it creates the possibility for universal suffrage. At the level of subjective mediation, universal suffrage intersects directly with class consciousness and institutional power. It allows the working class to translate awareness of their shared structural position into political representation and organizational leverage. Through suffrage, workers can influence legislation, finance, and governance, embedding their power within institutions. Regarding routes to state power, universal suffrage is essential for Route 1, parliamentary and legal reforms. It provides the formal mechanism through which the working class can achieve legal, economic, and social reforms that prepare the ground for a worker state. Without suffrage, parliamentary routes are blocked and reforms cannot mediate capital effectively. With Route 2, institutional power, universal suffrage extends beyond voting for policy reforms to reshaping institutions by giving workers democratic legitimacy to take control of municipalities, public services, cooperatives, and public finance, and to bind elected mandates to unions, councils, and movements. Suffrage provides authorization and legitimacy, while institutions provide capacity and continuity, together enabling workers to govern in practice before holding full state power. And regarding Route 3, revolutionary ruptures, Avineri does not treat universal suffrage as meaningless, even here. Before rupture, universal suffrage matters because it politicizes the masses, expands participation, and helps build organizational capacity and confidence. After rupture, universal suffrage matters because any worker state must reconstitute legitimacy on a universal democratic basis rather than just vanguard rule, which was the preferred Leninist route. We can now step back and see the full arc of Avineri's theory from how a worker's state becomes possible to what that state is ultimately for. We just talked about the first half of this chart, the path to a worker's state. Before we close, let's give a teaser for the next video, the goals of the worker's state. Once a worker's state emerges, Avineri then asks the next question. What is it for? Here again, the answer unfolds in three interconnected goals. First is the political dismantling of bourgeois class power. This does not abolish democracy, it transforms it. Capital's grip over the state is broken. Institutions are restructured, and universal suffrage is made real rather than merely formal. This is Aufhebung at the political level, preserving democratic forms while abolishing class domination. Second is the economic socialization of production. The productive capacities capitalism created are preserved, but private command is transcended or abolished. Key sectors are socialized, coordination is redirected towards social need, so democracy enters the economy itself. Universal suffrage now extends into civil society, to use Hegel's term, which really is about the economy. Third is human emancipation and the self transcendence of the state. As democratic control spreads across social life, the state loses its character as a power standing over and above society. Authority is absorbed into collective self governance, and the coercive state withers not by decree, but because it becomes unnecessary and irrelevant. Taken together, this is the core of Avineri's claim. The worker state is not an endpoint, but a transitional form whose success is measured by its ability to abolish itself. Its purpose is Aufhebung, preserving what capitalism made possible, and the worker state deepens, but abolishing its domination and opening the space for genuine human freedom. What's cool about the worker state is that it's a self-subverting authority. Its point is to eventually overcome itself and become unnecessary, like how a good teacher is no longer needed when the teaching is complete. Okay, thanks for going on this journey with me. I hope you enjoyed this sample from the Introduction to Marxism online course. If you want to go deeper into Avineri's theory of the goals of the worker state so you can fully understand his theory of revolution, I've posted that video for free as well. Please take a look, like, and subscribe. It helps me a lot. And if you want to support us further so we can keep making leftist content, you can support me on Patreon or just buy the course and leave a review. That would be great. Okay, solidarity forever. Thanks a lot. See you later.